Hello friends, this is Niladri Mahapatra once again, and today we'll talk about user story. We'll try to understand in depth of user story, what exactly the user story is and the different characteristics and details of it. Okay, so let's talk about the topics quickly, and we'll talk about what is the user story. We'll show some sample story cards, how the story cards looks like. We'll talk about the structure of user story, 3C, what exactly that acronym is, and user story characteristics. We'll talk about invest and we'll see some example, and the Scrum roles on different user story, how it is related to a user story of different roles. User stories association, what are the different associations of one user story with different fields and values. We'll talk about that. Then we'll talk about in details of what is acceptance criteria is, and we'll also talk about when a user story can be written or updated, and we'll talk about different types of user story and hierarchy of user story. So those are all what we'll talk about. So let's begin. So what exactly a user story is? A user story are most widely used agile techniques to capture product requirement or functionality. How it is different than our traditional way, we'll get to know about the details going forward in this session. So if you can read this, you can see in Agile Software Development, the execution level requirements or functionality is termed as user story. So a requirements details content for each and every small requirements are user story. So in the user story, when we create user story, those are small requirements contributing to the entire functionality that we need as a whole. So if we talk about how this user story helps to different role, we can see it can help the developer. They can start and finish the development by getting the requirement. They can understand what exactly the requirement is and what are the details, acceptance criteria, different links or different documents that related to it, everything content in one user story, and that helps the developer. For a tester also, it gives what needs to be developed, what are the acceptance criteria, what are the how they will be create the test case. That information they get from a user story. And for the product owner also, they give the requirement and also they mention something to verify the desired functionality to accept the story that it is completed or it is delivered or not. But along as a team, and everyone, the developer, tester, cross-functional teams or the product owner combinedly, they can also identify from a user story about their dependencies, about their risk and the complexity and the amount of work. So those combinedly we can identify, and each user story actually produce a value to the existing product or the upcoming product and gives an increment on the value of that particular product. Please note that every user story has to fulfill a requirement with a very specific goal or benefit. What does that mean is, whenever I am creating a user story, I need to have some functionality that is contributing to the existing product or giving an incremental value to the functionality that I am looking for. So it should not be partial or it should not be meaningless. It always advisable to break any story into as smaller stories you can make. So if you have a big functionalities that we need to develop, we need to break each and every requirement into small part, as small as possible, that can keep a value that we can deliver. So we'll not be breaking the stories in a development or testing or analysis aspect. We'll be keeping that full functionality intact and breaking into small size. So instead of saying making a whole web page, I can say, okay, instead of making a whole web page and giving the requirement in one story, I can say make one story for creating the login page where we'll be having limited number of functionalities. So in that way we can actually give some additional functionality. So can we break that login page into smaller part? If possible, that can, after breaking individually, we can deliver two different functionalities, we'll do that. But if not, we'll keep the functionality in one story and we'll try to break the stories as small as possible keeping in mind that it has to deliver a value. Similarly, requirement of a story has to be a complete functionality that I was talking about, means upon completion of development, testing and acceptance, the code should be deployable or parked for future release. Whatever you are developing or testing, that user story has to go or can be potentially identified for future release, that can be potentially shippable and should have some values. And size of a user story, that we already talked about in another video or another session about what exactly the agile estimation and how we estimate story points. So that's estimation we do with story points for the user story. So just try to let's understand what are the different structure of user story. When we talk about structure of user story, so we know there are three different parts of user story. One part is have the title, that's contain role, goal and benefit. Another part is a description area, and another part of this acceptance criteria. So this title of role, goal, benefit, we use, that's a very good practice of writing as a role I want goal, so that the benefit and the expected outcome, benefit or expected outcome what you want to write. The acceptance criteria is very crucial for a user story to use in a unit testing, or that so that a tester can create test cases from the acceptance criteria. The product owner or the stakeholders can verify based on what are the acceptance criteria they had and how they will be able to verify that. So if you look into these 5 parts, these role, goal, benefit, and we have description of the user story where it has all the requirements of what exactly the requirement is. If you have some business logic, or if you want to give some details, if you want to attach some wireframe, everything you attach as a part of that description. And then acceptance criteria that we used to add along with a part of user story. Those are the 5 different areas, and we actually club this role, goal and benefit, this area, as a part of our title, or that is the card area. So when we talk about a 3C, these are the 3 portion common 1C. We'll talk about that in later slide. So let's elaborate this particular areas by a sample user story. So we already know we have role, goal, benefit, description and acceptance criteria, and let's see, this is one of the title. So what I'm saying, as a SG application admin, I want to be able to create a new product with the mandatory columns, and this is what we have. So we have as A, that is this is the role, and I want what exactly you want and what's the benefit. And if I actually look into what is the role, so this is my role area, and this is I want to be able to create with mandatory columns, that will be my goal area. And what is the benefit? So these 3 portions, even it is a part of title, we break it into multiple 3 sections: role, goal and benefit. Now we have a description like this, where we can say add a new product page and give the field descriptions, you attach some wireframe, everything goes on a description. And the acceptance criteria, that's also goes at the end, and where we says, okay, this is the acceptance criteria, we have a bullet points number that we says this has to be done, this has not to be done. So if you see, this is an entire user story, and the requirement section of the user story, the title, the description and the acceptance criteria. And if we actually talk about what is this acceptance title, is the stories are traditionally written on notes cards and invitation to conversations. So normally if you actually have worked on storyboards on physical board or in a digital board, this section goes as a text part of your story card, where the description is the detail behind the story come out during conversation. So when we talked about a story, because at the time when a story is first initiating, it may not be having all this information, because it's not mandatory that when you are creating a user story it has to have all the information. During the course of the sprint or for the backlog grooming, we mature up these stories, and when we say, okay, this information is agreed by the entire team, we say, okay, this story is now ready. We'll talk about what is definition of ready for understanding or thinking a story is ready. We'll talk about that in some other session. And the acceptance criteria that confirms, okay, this is what exactly the area that will help us to give a confirmation, okay, this story is now done. Over here we'll talk about this 3C. We talk about what is 3C. So if we distribute or break the stories into 3 different sections, These are one section that we call card. This description is one section that we call as composition or conversation. You can also say conversation, you can say composition, and this is the confirmation area. So card, composition or conversation, and this is our confirmation, that is acceptance criteria. Now let me show you these all details in a real-time stories. You may have any ALM tool like Rally or version 1 or Jira, even if you are using your Excel or TFS. I'll be showing you in one example within Jira to see what are the card, what are the composition or conversation and confirmation. Okay, so here this is a backlog within Jira, and we'll bring up one story from here, and we'll see what are the different areas that we are talking about. So these in backlog, these all are stories. I just have opened one of the stories where I have, this is my title, that's my card area, this is the description, and here I have the acceptance criteria within this description box. In many practice, you may create a custom field called acceptance criteria, or your ALM may provide an additional field for acceptance criteria, but if that is not there, you can just add your acceptance criteria here. So this is your card, this is your conversation or composition, and this is your acceptance criteria. So that's a real life example of how we can have our acceptance criteria or description. Here this description is very small. In a real life situation, it can be as big as possible, or as much as information you want to add as a part of description to make the developer and tester understand what exactly the requirement is, and to remove any assumptions. At the very beginning, your story may not be having all this information. During grooming session, we keep on talking about that story to clarify the doubts and understanding that we have and mature it up. So we'll be now coming to show some sample story cards. So as we actually talked about that role, goal and benefit, that is not compulsory that you will have to have the role, goal, benefit. So role, goal, benefit is okay, but you can still have the card is as a who, I want what, so that why. That's one of the way of writing your card. Another way is as a user type, I want some function so that I get the benefit. So that way also you can create your user stories card section. Also you can mention as a situation, I want some motivation so that the expected outcome is this. In that way you can have your card ready for all the stories. Now we'll talk about some characteristics of user story. When we create a user story, we know this is a very small requirement, and we need to give something as a part of requirement, something as a part of card, something as a part of acceptance criteria. But there are some characteristics. We follow some rules to maintain a user story or create a user story or make a mature user story, and those are, for an example, user story has to be independent in the sense that each and every user story has to have independence on its own, so that it's not depends on another story. So for an example, I'm creating a functionality for a login screen. I'll not be creating one story for creating the text box for user ID and another story for creating the user story or another story for creating the password field, or I'll not be creating the business logic for verification for the user ID in one story, or another user story for the UI screen. Also it has to be independent on the technical side, like we'll be creating in the users, once we'll talking about the user story, we'll be thinking about its development, analysis, testing, everything is a part of one user story. It should not be dependent on the other story. It has to be negotiable. So when we talk about negotiable, when we are creating the user story for the first time, it's not necessary that the user story will be having all the information, or whatever the information is written, that is confirmed and we cannot change it. So the product owner keeps on adding the ideas or upcoming functionalities that he thinks and keep on prioritizing them. And we used to go through a grooming session where we pick up the stories and priority. Those are already there. We need to work on our future sprint to find out whether those stories are ready or not ready to start working on. At that time, we also negotiate with our product owner or other cross-functional teams to put our views and changing the user story, keeping on okay, this can be possible, that cannot be possible, or just add this value, I have a doubt, just mention that clarification of the doubts. For an example, if I am saying okay, this will be a login screen, and in this case if it is fail, it will be giving a message, your user story is not showing what will be the text of message. So you can negotiate, okay, this kind of text of message will be possible, we can add that. And then some technical expert says okay, no, we can have another user story where we will be having list of all the messages with IDs, map up with those IDs. So instead of hard coding the message, we can have the ID of the message. So that kind of negotiation we do to mature up a user story. What we talk about, what is the definition of maturity? So we need to create a definition of ready at some point of time to give, these are the checklist to define for this particular team, that if a story will be treating as ready if this meets these points. Now the next point, after independent and negotiable, we can have valuable and vertical. So when we plan or create a user story, each user story has to have a value or vertical. What exactly the vertical means? If you think about a whole cake, it has multiple layers. So for an example, it has some toppings, then vanilla layer, then some bread layers. So if you just think about creating a cake and each layer is your for an example, analysis layer, a development layer, or if you actually look into the layers of your class structure, development or analysis, then UI layer, database layer, then you are having business logic. So different layers you create, and once you complete all the project in traditional way, all the layers are ready and you complete your project in 3 months or 6 months or 8 months. But in agile way, when we actually create a story, we think okay, instead of creating the entire cake, just create a slice of cake that will be having a value, so that we are slicing it vertically instead of creating horizontal layers of a cake. So once a cake slice is ready, that have a value that we can potentially sell it, or we can actually deploy it to production in your story. So that's how we call it's a valuable or vertical. Yes, now the estimable. So the story has to be estimable. It has to have the information that the developer, the tester can visualize the dependencies, the risk, whatever the complexities have, and what is the business value it will be, so that they can estimate it. So that information has to be there for a user story. It has to be small as possible, keeping all its value intact, or at say keeping all the keeping at least one value intact. We can break it down into the smaller piece, and it definitely has to be have testable. Whatever we are creating, we should have enough information to test the functionality that the developer is developing. So all these, in short, there is an acronym that's called INVEST. It's for INVEST: independent, negotiable, valuable, estimable, small, and testable. We have the characteristics already mentioned for I, for N, for V, for E, and S, and T. And this is the acronym of characteristic of user story. Whenever you needs to think about making a user story mature, just think about whether your user story is having all the characteristics or not. Now we'll be talking about the characteristic of acceptance criteria. So we have acceptance criteria of specific, measurable, achievable, relevant, and time bound. There is a short form or acronym called SMART whenever we create acceptance criteria. So acceptance criteria is the confirmation part of a user story. On 3C, we know we had a card, we have a conversation, and we had a confirmation area. So in the confirmation, that's the acceptance criteria. We are saying it has to be specific. So whatever we are mentioning, that has to be specific. Your acceptance criteria has to be very specific, that this is the target specific area of improvement, and we can visualize okay, this acceptance criteria means what exactly we will be testing or what we will be verifying. Measurable, definitely we can quantify. If you say okay, my web page should be load faster, we cannot quantify or we cannot measure that. Faster means what? 3 seconds is faster or 10 seconds is faster or half an hour is faster, I don't know. That has to be detailed out in the acceptance criteria, that load within 10 minutes or 10 seconds or 1 second or 2 seconds. It has to be achievable, so it has to be realistic. If I ask currently I need to improve the performance of this load from 1 minute to 1 millisecond, that may not be achievable, so we need to give something achievable acceptance criteria. Then relevant in the sense whatever the description we have, our acceptance criteria should be relevant to that. So if I am asking to create a login page, I will not be expecting that my profile page will change or something happen on my cart page. So my acceptance criteria should be relevant to the description that I have for that user story. And time bound, okay, this has to be time bound or specify when the result can be achieved and should have a specific duration or event. Yeah, so if you are saying that this page will show value or text box after some event, or if you make some changes, then it should appear, or after 1 day of clicking. So if you say after, it's not actually giving a real time difference. So we need to measure and give that time bound details in the acceptance criteria. And if you actually make your acceptance criteria keeping all these specific, measurable, achievable and relevant and time bound, you'll be finding out, okay, this is a very mature acceptance criteria, and that helps the developer, tester and the product owner to confirm their stories when it is done. So what confirm in the sense, when the developer says, okay, we already done, the tester have created their test cases based on the acceptance criteria, and they are ready to ask the product owner to verify or give a demonstration, they can actually refer to this acceptance criteria and verify whether it is fulfilling the need of acceptance criteria or not. Now we'll talk about few user story associations. What are the different association of a user story we may have? So there are one-to-one relationship we have. So we have a story ID. Definitely each story has to have one ID so that we can map with other user story or refer the story in with that ID. We have a story title, that is the first C of your 3C. We have a story rank. When we prioritize in different way, like whatever the prioritization you do, it's have a rank on all the list of stories on the backlog. Story description, that is the conversation or composition of the stories that we have talked about. And we have story points, that is the estimation. So story points is the estimation of the user story. We have story state. Each story go through a workflow states from starting to end of the story. So a story can be initially started as a backlog state or idea state, and then it goes to groomed, and then development in progress, then maybe go to verification, completed and done. So there can be many workflow states your organization defined, or the ALM have default states of your user story that should go through on its life cycle. So at any given point of time, your story has to have one state, and also the state of blocked or impediment. So if your story is currently one sprint and it's got blocked, we can have that states whether the story is blocked or not. Then if it is blocked, what is the blocked reason? That is the impediment reason. A story most of the time used to have one parent. So a story in some ALM tool, it's allow you to create one story under one story. So a story can be a parent of one story, but sometimes you can make a feature as a parent of one story. In Jira, you can make a epic as a parent of one story, and that way you can actually map stories. We'll talk about the hierarchy of user story, how the parents and child relationship are. So this is one of the relationship we have. We have a release information. Those are optional. If your story is marked for any specific release, any specific version, you can map that. The sprint information, if you already committed, whether it will be null or not committed, or a sprint number for that particular story. This one, sometimes some ALM tools provides you one-to-many relationships. So what happened is, if you have committed for one sprint and you didn't completed it, moved it forward to the backlog, and then again planned for another sprint, that story shows both the sprint where it was involved and planned for development. We also have a owner. So there are two things. One is owner, one is assigned to. So owner is someone who creates it, who is the reporter of the user story. So most of the time the product owner, the business analyst or stakeholders are the owner of user story. Assigned to is actually, it's not who is working on that. It's actually a user story can have multiple tasks. The task is executed by different developer and different tester. So assign to is one point of contact for that user story, mainly useful when you are actually demonstrating. Even there are 5 members working on that, we find out this person will be demonstrating that particular functionality, and that person is also single point of contact. Now one to many, we can have many child story. If the ALM supports story to story mapping, we can have tasks. So one story can have multiple tasks, and those tasks are having estimated effort, where we are saying the story have a story point where the task will be having effort. So cumulatively one story can have a number of total efforts that will be come up from the task. We can have dependencies. One story can depend on multiple story as a successor or as a predecessor, so we can have that relationship also. Then we can have multiple comments or discussion sections that we are continuously talking about as a log of those discussion as part of user story. We can create multiple defects. So those are actually sprint defects, not the defects coming from the productions. If at the time of development, if tester found some defects within a sprint, they can create defects under one user story. We can create test cases. So few LM supports, few LM don't support. So you can actually map the story ID with the test cases if you are doing it offline, and you can actually have some tags or any fields or any values that you want to categorize. There are many other fields possible within your ALM. You can create custom fields to have or to give more information to the story. For an example, you can give labels, you can give components, or you can also give project name or cost center. Now who can write or update a user story? So typically what happens, if you want to write a user story, those initially write or modify by the product owner, BA and story author. So, and they actually get help from development team if they need, and that is also need basis, the cross functional team or development team, and they create the user story, modify the user story. And this is not a one time activity. They can keep on doing that, keep on creating new stories or updating the existing stories. But there is something called technical spike. The technical spikes are all the analysis work or your discovery work that you want to do in the technical side, where there is no functionality you are adding. The development team and cross-functional team can create and modify the technical spike, and everything whatever you are creating, whether a technical spike or user story, everything goes back to the product backlog, and they are actually listed down with some identification. That's a technical spike or it's a actual user story or discovery story. We map in that way so that we can identify at the time of our sprint planning or grooming what exactly the story is, whom we should contact. So in case this is a user story, most of the time the owner we talked about maybe someone from the product owner mainly, or be a story author. But in technical spike, most of the time some of the development team or team architect team is the owner of this technical spike. Okay, when a user story can be written or updated, so we know the product owner will be creating user story, but when what are the instance they can create it? So creation, modification, and should not modify. So creation, anytime we can create a user story and add it into backlog. Modifying anytime till it's not groomed. So when we are saying okay, we are grooming a story, we will be estimate. So groom, at the time of grooming we estimate the user story as well, and during estimation we give a story point. So till the time it's not estimated, it can be modified. But what happen if there is some changes came up and we need to make changes? So if change after groomed, we need to re-groom, and then we mark it as again groom. So we should not modify once it is groomed. We can do multiple time of discussion. We say okay, this is not ready for grooming, we need further information, and we'll sit on next grooming session, and finally after 2-3 grooming maybe we marked okay, this story X is now groomed. After that, if there is a chance when it needs to be changed, that product owner identified, then we'll be re-groom it and re-estimate it, and should not modify when. So once we have committed for sprint, it's very rare chances that there is a need of changing on the requirement side. Most of the time we should not make any change once we have committed. If you think there is something required to be changed, we need to see what state we are in current sprint. That if it is the very beginning of the sprint and we still have time to accommodate new discussion, new grooming and new estimation for that story, we'll go ahead with that. If we are already made of the story, we say okay, there are some critical changes required, whatever we talked about may not be relevant anymore, so we'll close the story and create a new story with the new update, and we'll replan in our next planning meeting. So these are the different time or events you can create, modify your user story. So if you want to talk about hierarchy of user story, what are the different hierarchies? So if you look into this picture where we have the story level item and some portfolio level items. On the story level item we have stories, and within stories we can have multiple tasks, but story actually belongs to features. Those features may belongs to initiatives or epic, and those the themes you have. So different ALM tools talked about differently. So if you talk about Jira have only story and epic, so that way these are related. In Rally they have story, then feature, they have then epic, and then above epic they have initiatives. So different ALM tools have the structure named differently, but if you talk about team level, a story can have task, and the defects, a story can have multiple defects also within sprint. So the task we estimate within hours, where a story cumulative of all those hours may goes into days, and a feature when you talk about that actually for multiple weeks. Epic can take multiple months, and the themes are actually initiatives. So the big ideas, the big solutions are planned for years. So those are a very high level hierarchy of user story when you will be working on particular any ALM tool. You may find it little differently of their architecture, how that is planned for. So if you talk about types of user story, we know one type is definitely user story, and the anything else is not a user story. So if we talk about user story and non-user story, what are the non-user stories are? So if we can have discovery story, so anything you are working for, discovering something for future development, or you want to explore something, so those all are the discovery stories. If you want to create some technical changes on the database side, data migration to enable our future development, we create technical spikes that directly don't adds any value to your business, but we need that to enable our future stories to work on, so that we can add some values to the product. And these enablers are kind of another analysis work. So technical spikes mostly are the analysis and research work, where enabler is actually enable your system or enable your architecture or application environment to add or create or work on future stories, work on future testing environment to make your user story success to provide a business goal. So those are the three types: discovery, technical spikes, all research and analysis you do here, an enabler, another technical works that you do to enable your environment to work on user story. Okay, so those are different areas of user stories we have talked about. If you want to know something in details or something specific, feel free to add a comments, or you can just drop a mail. I will like to respond you as soon as possible. Thank you for watching. This is Niladri Mahapatra. I hope you like this video. Don't forget to subscribe us. I will be adding few more videos on different areas on Agile, and we'll see you on our next video. Till that time, have a wonderful day. Bye bye.